Hi, are you brainwashed? I see everybody shaking their head. No, no way out there. But are you really sure? Are you sure that your friends and neighbors and relatives and business associates are brainwashed as well? Well, if you're not sure, watch this episode, number 62 of the Doctor Podcast show, where we have today one of the world's leading experts on brainwashing. We have Dr. Joel Dimsdale. Dr. Dimsdale is a professor emeritus of psychiatry at the University of California in San Diego. He received his MD degree from Stanford University. He was on the faculty of Harvard Medical School from 1976 to 1985. He's the author of over 500 publications on this topic and other related subjects, and also an editor of many books. And one of the most important books is the one we're going to discuss today, which is called Dark Persuasion, A History of Brainwashing from Pavlov to Social Media. Joel, thanks very much for taking the time to come speak with us today. This is a really super interesting, hot topic these days, especially with the elections going on, which we'll get to in a few moments. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Now, let's start by defining what brainwashing is. People use it in different ways, some accurate, some not accurate. What's the technical correct description or definition of brainwashing?
It's an excellent question. It's a term that has just captured everybody's interest. And it's a sloppy term that people who've studied in this area despise the term. A better term is coercive persuasion. That has the nubbin of what's going on. But brainwashing just caught on as a term. It was really devised by an OSS operative in the 1950s. And he was a propaganda specialist, and his term was magnificent. So the problem is that, there are a lot of, if you think of persuasion on a continuum, there are a lot of things in persuasion that are benign. We talk with each other, we talk with friends, acquaintances, strangers. We use a form of persuasion in education, in psychotherapy, lots of areas where persuasion is not so concerning.
Right. You mentioned
Coercive,
OSS earlier. Could you just explain what OSS is?
it was the predecessor to the CIA. OSS really um, emerged in World War II. Sorry for that acronym. We all have acronyms that we're so comfortable with. So what people started observing closely in the 50s, although this goes way back in time, is that there's a recipe for coercive persuasion, and that is if you put somebody under massive stress,
Hmm.
if you sensory isolate them from friends, family, if you sleep deprive them, and if you repeat messages, this is a very powerful tool for shaking people up. And now this goes way back in time, goes back centuries to torture, to inquisition. But where we in medicine started to encounter it was from the scientist Pavlov during the times of the Russian Revolution. When we think of Pavlov, we all think of drooling dogs.
Right.
But Pavlov was an absolute genius. He could train a dog to respond to the note C on a piano, but to ignore C sharp. So
Really?
he was a very skilled trainer, but he got interested in human behavior rather indirectly. His dog labs in St. Petersburg were along the Neva River, and the river flooded, a massive flood, towards the beginning of the 20th century. And the dogs almost drowned. They were in the basement in cages, and they were rescued at the last minute by an animal handler who dunked the dog out, got it out of the crate, and got it out in air. But what Pavlov observed was that his dogs were never the same, that they forgot everything that he had so meticulously trained them to do, that their dispositions changed, that previously aggressive dogs became timid, etc., and that their preferences changed. A dog that used to love you hated you, and vice versa. So this got Pavlov very interested in human behavior change under stress. He was the most prominent physician in the early Soviet Union, and his work came to the attention of Lenin, who visited him, made a site visit, stayed for a couple hours, and Lenin asked Pavlov, "Look, can you help me change the Soviet people so that they'd become good communists?"
Wow.
And Pavlov, like any academic who's looking for funds, will say, "Why, yes." So with that, Lenin and later Stalin endowed Pavlov with a huge institute of 350 postdocs, etc. And Pavlov started working on these issues about coerced behavior change. Uh, and it started to take off from a medical perspective during World War II, in that both sides, both the Nazis and the Allies, were very interested in whether drugs could coerce truth. If you
Mm.
capture the enemy, could you elicit the truth without torture, which is messy and takes time? Uh, so, all the time in contemporary medicine, we have drugs which we repurpose and discover, gosh, they have these other uses. So similarly, in medicine, we found that obstetrical drugs and were also helpful in relaxing people and making them more persuadable.
So,
The
is it true that communism was actually the first mass coercive persuasion, or the first massive form of brainwashing, going back about 100 years?
I would put that a little differently. Um, we have been coercing behavior for centuries.
Right.
The question is how skilled we were and whether we were using scientific approaches. Did we test a hypothesis? That didn't work. I'll try this. Were we shaped, were our action changed by theory? Pavlov brought that to the fore. Now, um, it's a mistake to think that Pavlov was a communist. He loathed the communists, um,
Really.
but he was useful to them, and they were useful to him. Uh, I think what we found as the 20th century went on is that this is a tool that everybody was interested in. So,
Persuading people.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Now,
I
Pavlov, I think, got a Nobel Prize eventually. Is that correct?
He got his Nobel Prize for physiology. The if you will, the autonomic nervous system and gastric physiology. So the slobbering dogs were right, but uh, uh, he wasn't doing this just for his jollies. He was meticulously interested in things. I think where the field really took off was during the Cold War years of the 50s. Now, in the 50s, maybe we all remember it as Ozzie and Harriet, and that was peaceful and it was so nice back then as compared to now. Not
Right. That
so.
was the perfect family back then.
A perfect family, threats of nuclear annihilation, spy scares, right? McCarthy, lots of stuff was going on. And a lot of it was in the area of doctrine and belief. Um, you know, the Cold War, yes, it was a little bit about territory, as wars are, but it was a great deal about belief, a secular religious belief. And we wanted to persuade them just as much as they wanted to persuade us. That really hit the fan during the Korean conflict, a conflict which, as you know, has never ended.
Right.
We've got a rough armistice, which blows up a few times a year with little kertuffles. But in the war, some Americans were captured by the North Koreans and the Chinese communists. And a few of them, a very small number, defected. Now, I think we're a bit more sophisticated today. I mean, and in medicine, we know that, 1 out of 1,000, well, okay, that happens.
Right.
1 out of 10,000, it happens. So there were roughly 35 of these American POWs who defected. There were hundreds of thousands of troops. Now we'd say that's wrong and all that, but back then it was just a thunderclap that convulsed the nation. What are we doing wrong? What secret tricks were the communists up to? Uh, well, some of the secret tricks that the communists were up to were sleep deprivation,
Mm.
total isolation, massive stress, uh, and group pressures. This was an add-on that the Chinese communists found. Uh, the We were just appalled by this and set up an unusual relationship between the intelligence community and academia. And much of it was set up in your neck of the woods. The MK Ultra
Right.
was a way of funneling funds via Cornell's Institute of Social Ecology to universities throughout the country to do research, what has been called by some a, a Manhattan Project of the mind, to do research on behavior change, coercive persuasion.
Who was funding that research? The money was given to various universities.
It went through a couple different shell funding sources. It rarely came directly from the CIA. And before I go on, I don't think taking funding from the CIA is a sin at all. I think the question is, what are the strings on the research, and what were you doing? Uh, there were different strings back in the 50s, and some of the research was just appalling. Uh, So to answer your question, the CIA sent the money to MK to a branch of it called MK Ultra, which then sent the money to the Institute of Social Ecology at Cornell, and they then sent the money, sprinkled the money far and wide. There were some other smaller institutes. There was one in Georgetown called the Geschichter Foundation, and they all did a mixture of recognizable research and dark research. The dark research focused on surreptitious drugging people, putting helmets on people, repeating messages over and over and over. I don't know whether you're a fan of the Jason Bourne books or movies. I adore them. And if you recall the plot, Jason Bourne is this nice young man who's had some hard times in his life and sees this avuncular psychiatrist who says, there, I'll make it better. I'll change all your memories. And Jason signs up, and the psychiatrist wipes out all of Bourne's memories and uh, converts him into the consummate assassin. Well, the curious thing is, except for the consummate assassin, that's exactly what some of the research did. Psychiatry, neurology, psychology, the leaders in the field. These were not necessarily people who were struggling for fame but weren't very good at what they did. These were leaders in the field, and they worked very meticulously on the circumstances that could make people more susceptible to coercive persuasion.
Right. So it started basically as putting huge amount of stress on the brain, basically putting you in situations like that so that you could brainwash people into changing their ideology and their thoughts, etc. But now that's evolved. How has that evolved to where it is now, and what techniques are being used now to brainwash people, and what are the psychological effects of brainwashing on an individual?
So all of medicine's advances are fair game for application. I used to run a lab. I used to run a sleep lab. I used to study autonomic nervous system physiology. Now, sleep labs everywhere are studying sleep deprivation. Uh, in the old days, we used to think that total sleep deprivation was required to do a lot of behavior change. Now we know that partial sleep deprivation is sufficient. Now think about that. Partial sleep deprivation, 4 hours a night. You and I, when we used to be on call, 4 hours a night was fine.
Right.
And we groused about it, but we didn't feel necessarily bad the next day. The problem is, as we've come to realize from lots of cases of trainees and our own performance, problem is that our limitations are opaque to us, and 4 hours can influence our performance in all sorts of ways. When we take people in a lab and we partially sleep deprive them, we can see that they are more amenable to social influence. And we can test that in all sorts of ways in terms of asking a Confederate for advice. And when the Confederate gives you bogus advice, you accept it when you're sleep deprived. But that's one corner of it. The other corner uh, would have to be in terms of social manipulation and where do we see that at its strongest? I think you'd have to say social media.
Right.
And we already know that this is an enormously powerful uh, introduction. It's it's a social contagion, and whenever we encounter a new contagion, we're helpless. Whether that's a new virus, or a new drug of abuse, or in this case, social media itself. And we have simply not learned to shape how we deal with that culturally. Look, we've been driving for automobiles for 100 years, and we have some general agreement about drinking and driving, but it's still a huge problem. Well, we have zero agreement about social media. So what happens in social media?
Right. It doesn't sleep deprive you unless you're up all night, on Facebook or Twitter or X or whatever.
So,
And
so
they
then
don't give you drugs through the internet. So
they
how
don't
do
give you
they? Yeah, go
so they
ahead.
don't give you drugs on the internet, but you said a very important point. You're not sleep deprived unless you're doing it all night. So the issue is, are people able to pull themselves away? Are they saying that's enough? I'll put my phone down. I'll shut my computer down. I've got other things to do. It's difficult for people to do that, and it's difficult, particularly for people who don't have a lot of sophistication or experience in the world. Now, that's interesting. One of
Mhm.
the things I studied in my book, Dark Persuasion, was the Stockholm Syndrome and hostage behavior. There's a curious database called the HABAS, or Hostage and Barricade Situation Database. It's a dishearteningly large database of something like 100,000 hostage situations. How many of these hostages go on to develop a Stockholm syndrome under that coercion and stress? Well, it turns out that people of somewhat less life experience, less sophistication, are more susceptible to the Stockholm syndrome. And I think we see that a little bit with our kids, and with socially isolated younger people. Uh, they get sucked in. They tune in only to their favorite channels. I mean, really only to their favorite channels. And they then get fed certain consistent messages. They don't get any other messages. So, what do you have? You've got the sleep deprivation, the social isolation. Ah, I didn't mention the stress, did I? Well,
Right.
the issue is that there's an awful lot of bullying that goes on, malicious bullying on social media. So, you've got some powerful ingredients for behavior change. The It's hard to underestimate just how bad, uh, overestimate how bad the malice is. Uh, I don't know. A couple of years ago, I got something stuck in my toaster and I couldn't get it out, and so I thought, okay, well, I'll just type it up, and I was appalled by the suggestions. One person said, well, plug your toaster in and pour some hot water in and then turn it on, and that'll get it out. So There are people who enjoy maliciously teasing people. Uh,
Hmm.
uh, so there is a lot of stress exposure in social media, to be sure. I
What,
guess
yeah. What about rewards? Are people getting dopamine rewards when they tune in to their favorite websites or social media platforms? So is that also somehow accentuating it?
people there are lots of labs who are playing around with the neuropsychopharmacology of social media, and uh, it's a big business, and the we have yet to learn the fine structure of it. I think the bigger question is, what do we do about it? Um, and the disinformation. You mentioned elections. Now I should tell you that when I started working on this book about brainwashing, this was uh, before the elections, and I didn't write the book with that in mind, but we've certainly seen the enormous skill of disinformation today. When I wrote the book, I focused a bit on Stalin's trials and the historic airbrushing of people out of the Politburo pictures of leadership, but that is so trivial in comparison to what can be done today. I think this is uh, it's a societal issue that we in the States are going to have a particularly tough problem with because we have such a passionate belief in freedom of speech. And we are going to have to come to terms with some balancing act. And I'm not sure what that would be. They're not going to ask me. This is going to be a fought out political decision that will take decades to resolve.
So I try to get a broad perspective of opinions and ideas from different sources. So I'll watch Fox News, I'll watch Newsmax to get the conservative and Republican perspective. I'll then watch CNN, MSNBC, and get their perspective, and then try to formulate my own opinions from those sources and other media sources. But what's interesting is everybody on CNN and MSNBC considers all Trump supporters to be part of a cult and they're all brainwashed. On the other hand, you see the same thing on Fox News and Newsmax and similar media. They consider everybody who's watching CNN and MSNBC to be brainwashed and in that cult. So, who's really in a cult? Who's brainwashed? How do you decide that? How do you know if you're being brainwashed or not?
Well, you're probably, I don't know whether you're in a 1% minority or a tenth of a percent minority in the broad taste of your viewing and your tolerance of being able to look at things across a spectrum.
I
Uh,
have to do it. Otherwise, I feel like I'm being brainwashed if I just watch one side. I get anxious thinking, oh, what if they're brainwashing me? So I got to watch everything. But how does the average person figure out if they're brainwashed or in a cult?
so, so let me just tiptoe back and not use the word brainwash in that sense, okay? Because um, I'm not sure technically that's the best word for that, but how does somebody know when they've been sucked into a cult?
Right.
It is very difficult, and the issue is how do they extricate themselves from a cult? There are lots of groups that are exclusive, and it's natural. You associate with people that you agree with, you do business with them, you know them, you live in a neighborhood, all of those things. But there's a door. And the question is there a fence or a door around the cult? Now, it might be a physical fence, or it could be a symbolic fence. Uh, if you left the cult, would you feel bereft and guilty? Well, probably, but can you get out of that after some days, weeks, months? Maybe. Some cults have a literal fence. Jonestown had barbed wire fence in the middle of the jungle. There was no way out of that cult. Heaven's Gate, which was in my neck of the woods in San Diego, didn't have a fence, but these people had been together for decades. And even though they walked around and did business, they were website designers. They ultimately staged this mass suicide in conjunction with the Hale-Bopp comet. So I'm dodging your question. I apologize. How do you know?
Right.
I think if you're lucky, you have friends and family who will gently keep asking you, but it is very difficult. And because frequently, by the time people have been in this group, they're not paying any attention. And we see this everywhere, and it has nothing to do with intelligence. Zero. Now look at all those kids at Sarah Lawrence a couple of years ago. It has a lot to do with relative isolation and youth, but there are some bright people. In Jonestown, there were PhDs. There were all kinds of people of different backgrounds. So who's brainwashed, Fox or MSNBC? I have troubles watching either of them because
Right.
I'm one of those few people around who are still kind of a centrist. So um, I'm suspicious of anybody who claims that they know the truth.
So there isn't truth. Truth is what you perceive to be the truth, basically.
Well, um, I think you have to acknowledge the possibility that you might be wrong. There are truths. I don't believe that one makes it up on the hoof, but one can be mistaken and one needs to look at data. You know, our perspective in medicine is very different. Look at what happened with COVID. We thought, we thought we've got randomized clinical trials. We have meta-analyses. We know the truth and people will follow the truth and the truth will set them free. Well, that didn't work out particularly well.
Right.
So, and that I think is one of medicine's next challenges. If we started spending a certain percent of our research budget on communication as opposed to fundamental cellular biology, that might help us in a public health way enormously. I think I went off on a tangent, but I believe that this issue of uh, people being willing to consider another view and being open to the idea, well, what would change your viewpoint? What might you accept as an evidence that you were mistaken? That's what we need to shoot for. That's what we need to do in education right now for our children and our students, some degree of savvy and a certain humility that people, anybody promising you the message, I would just turn around.
Right. One of the things that I've discovered from speaking with my patients, I'm an ophthalmologist, but I know many patients for many years, so we have all sorts of discussions. And occasionally they'll talk to me about their political persuasion and tell me they're adamantly for this party or that party or whatever. And I ask them, you ever try to watch, the other TV station and get a different perspective? And they get anxious about, no, I can't watch that. I get sick to my stomach just from watching Fox News or CNN or whatever. So maybe is a telltale sign that you're being brainwashed, the fact that you're developing anxiety from even watching or listening to an opposing view. Is that an early warning signal?
I would say that it's a sign that you are increasingly isolated in only one perspective. Now, the curious thing, since we're talking about politics, the curious thing is that this is not a small cult. We're talking about an enormously close election where the election is going to turn on 1%, 2%. So we're not talking about some odd, small, eccentric group of people. But if we are talking about what does it mean to be a citizen, to be informed, uh, one would have to be informed about what the other side is doing.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. The other thing that's been on my mind for years and decades, when my kids were younger, I always told them that when they're hanging out in a group of people, they need to be extra careful because I always told them when you're in a group, you're going to do things that you normally wouldn't do, and that's sometimes gets you into trouble. So I was always concerned about the group. And in your book, I think you had some quotes that said, if you say it in front of others, you'll do it. Once you do it, you'll think it. Once you think it, you'll believe you thought of it yourself. Tell us about group psychology and how that can persuade people and coerce people to doing things or saying things that they normally wouldn't do or say when they're alone.
So, look, you're an ophthalmologist. When you examine patients, you know that you are going to mess with the refraction a little bit here, a little bit there. And you know how suggestible people are. And you don't always do the same direction. You're always testing things. So um, whether you think of it or not, you are focusing on persuasion and trying as best as you can to remove that aspect to get at the physical metrics of seeing. Um, Look, we see this all the time from the kind of studies um, we're exposed to in college about conformity pressure. If you bring people into a room and you say which line is longer, this one or this one, and it doesn't take much to persuade people. Well, maybe I was wrong. He, he said it.
Right.
He's probably right. So we see this all the time that we are uh, quite susceptible to conformity pressure, and we become more susceptible the more we're isolated from anchors that can ground our understanding of the world. And who are our anchors? Our anchors are friends and family, and our anchors are being able to look around and compare this observation with that observation. Are we sure about it? when we isolate people, we remove those anchors and people drift and become susceptible to persuasion, which I would say is coercive.
Mm. Another controversial subject, is religion a form of brainwashing? Everybody or almost everybody believes that their religion is the best or the right one. And in some cases, they want to convert other people to their religion because they know theirs is correct. So is religion a subtle form of brainwashing, or is it something different?
Well, there's a little ditty out there that says, a cult is any religion stranger than your own. So
That's a good one. I like that.
all of our religions uh, can be pretty strange when you really look at them from the distance.
Not
Uh,
mine though.
well, and
Just
religion
the,
has been very interested in conversion. Uh, and conversion is sometimes done under uh, under coercion. It's forced. It's sometimes convenience, and sometimes it's conformity pressure. During the even until the 19th century, uh, uh, in Rome, um, there are these etchings that show the Jews being forced to attend Mass on a Saturday afternoon, and where a priest would harangue them about why they should convert and the limitations of Judaism and the superiority of Catholicism. And the Jews didn't like it, but they were forced to be there. And some Jews put beeswax in their ears so they wouldn't have to listen to these sermons. And I encountered a wonderful etching in the Jewish Museum of Rome a couple of years ago that shows this poor guy in the back of the church with guards um, holding him down and pulling the wax out of his ears so that he would listen to the sermon and be converted. So, yeah, religion's been very interested in this issue, and I've been thinking that this might be the topic for my next book, but I haven't decided yet because I think these issues of how we change our opinion about things intrigue me. And the brainwashing book, of course, was about how people are forced to change their opinion frequently in devastating ways. And there are so many ways that this is done. And I believe these techniques are getting more and more sophisticated. And regrettably, people are reading our research and making their own decisions about how to deploy those research findings. And they're not in directions that you or I might be comfortable with.
right. Now you mentioned in the past the MK Ultra and other forms of torture that were used to brainwash people. Are we heading into new territory now where it's kind of subtle torture? It's not obvious torture, and maybe some of the testing and experimenting that's being done is really unethical, but it's not as obviously unethical as torture.
Well, so torture by definition means imposition of extraordinary pain or threat. Um, and certainly in university settings, any study of that would not be acceptable. Uh, might there be uh, government agencies here, there, or anywhere that might be interested? Well, I suspect the answer to that is yes. And one of the things that that I learned when I was doing all this work about brainwashing is just how the research has flourished in many countries. It's not just the United States or Russia. This is a tool uh, that is being used by everybody. So sure, I haven't talked today with you about neuroscience very much, but absolutely we can do things now that uh, would have been impossible in the 50s. And with surgical techniques, we could potentially do all sorts of things in the way of behavior change.
Right.
Uh,
One of the issues now is you're probably familiar with Neuralink, Elon Musk's company, where he implants electrodes and is able to uh, catch brain signals to perform physical activities on a computer or with robots. The concern is that possibly these electrodes might be used to program the brain as well, to send the signal in the other direction. Do you think we're heading into a problem there, especially now with AI, where potentially an AI computer could reprogram someone's brain with some sort of electrical device that's implanted?
we're going to need to come to terms with the capabilities we have. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, direct brain stimulation. What are the uses? Um, what are the risks and benefits? What are the trade offs? We're going to need to come to terms with that. Now, to the extent that it is directly invasive, that will stay somehow in medical hands and somehow uh, have a patina of medical ethics involved in the judgment. If it is not so invasive, transcranial magnetic stimulation, for instance, well, that's not going to be just in our hands. There are going to be people messing around with that. Uh, the So yeah, we're going to have to come to terms with this.
Yeah, it's a big problem. Now I know you're trained in psychiatry. That's your specialty. How did you become interested in brainwashing and coercive persuasion during your career?
Uh, it's a bit of a long answer. I've always been interested in why people make bad decisions and how do they do this. I Years ago studied Nazi cabinet ministers and trying to understand what drove them. And curiously, I got interested in that because my office at Mass General, some guy showed up um, carrying a gun case and said, "Are you Dimsdale?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I'm the executioner and I've come for you." So he
Whoa.
pushed his way into my office, opened the gun case, and out popped documents. He was the hangman of Nuremberg, the executioner, and he told me that I needed to start studying the perpetrators. Uh, so that got me involved on a study of Nazi cabinet ministers and what could drive them to make these decisions. But I realized I wasn't really studying the perpetrators. Um, I studied the orchestrators, the cabinet ministers. But what about the people in society, the people who did the hands on killing? Was that propaganda? Was it mental illness? Was it brainwashing? And what the heck did that funny word mean? I so I've always been interested in this, but probably would not have pursued it except for my neighbors, because my neighbors in San Diego were in the Heaven's Gate cult, the mass suicide. And when people do terrible things long ago and far away, you can ignore it. But when it's in your neighbors, you have to say, this is something that's in the repertoire of of behavior that we have to understand. So that's the personal reason why I got interested in this. But as I read more and more, I realized this is not such a Baroque idea, that it's not some magic. This is something that's grounded in neurophysiology and behavior. And there have been brilliant people and rogues all together studying this for at least a century.
Right. I think that people should read your book just to become educated about this process. I think if you learn about the process and what's been done in the past and how it's possible to change your brain and your thoughts, then you can be a little more careful and avoid being thoroughly brainwashed. Do you think that's correct?
I uh, Sure, I hope people will read my book, but I think the bigger issue, other than uh, reading my book, is education and the role of education. And does education offer us a chance? We
Well,
educate.
it depends who's doing the education.
So education in the good old-fashioned way of examining thoughts, testing hypotheses, seeing what appears to work, looking at costs and benefits. We've been doing that for thousands of years, and it's now we've got to deploy that skill set as we confront these problems of coercive persuasion, because the 21st century is going to expose us to a lot of very not pretty alternatives.
Right. Yeah, and nuclear weapons, AI, lots of things on the horizon that could be the end. So it's important for people to learn. What about this issue of, you mentioned misinformation, disinformation? Everybody claims the other side is the one lying. And again, are there any special ways to figure out who's telling the truth and who's lying?
Um, Years ago, when the internet was just starting, um, I was working at a cancer center and uh, troubled by how patients were using the internet to make their medical judgments.
Right.
And so a resident and I just kind of put together a brief paper about what sites should we be suspicious of. And it was very practical, homegrown observations. And this is the type of stuff that we need to be aware of today about everything. Don't trust any site that claims it knows the truth.
Right.
Don't trust testimonials. Words can be changed, distorted, made up. If it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true.
Right.
So there are some things like this that can help us when we confront information and disinformation. Uh, no politician will turn around and say to you, I'm just in this for my own good. I couldn't care a fig for you or anybody like you. Just give me your money and shut up and sit down. Nobody's going to say that.
Right. Yeah, it's becoming more difficult to figure out what's real and not. You've probably seen some of the AI videos that have come out in the last few weeks. is one of Kamala and Trump dancing together and kissing and all kinds of bizarre stuff. And it looks real. If you look at it, it's almost impossible to determine that it's totally fake. Plus, you can put words in people's mouth and actually have them lip sync the words, so it looks like they made that speech and said those things. So I think we're in for lots of trouble.
Um, yes, and I don't want to necessarily end just on the trouble. I think it's going to be a rock and rolling century with lots of things that are going to be new and different, and we're going to have to watch out, just the way our parents told us, look both ways when you cross the street. We're going to need to do that for the rest of our lives, and be very careful. So
That's good advice, and I'm looking forward to your next book. Should be very interesting, and I think you're getting a lot more material every day to write about. So I want to thank you very much for taking your time from your schedule to appear today on the Doctor Podcast show. And this has been very informative and educational, and I think many people will benefit from it.
thanks very much for the invitation.
My pleasure.